Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the SCA Coaches Corner, Heroes and Traditions. This is our second part of our look into the Kingdom of Caid, and we're very excited this evening with the guests that we have and the subject matter at hand. My partner in crime on these endeavors is, I always say His Grace Brennan, but His Royal Highness Brennan. Brennan, hope everything is well with you this evening. It's great to see you.
Great to see you. It's a lovely day for episode 150 of Coach's Corner, a milestone. We are incredibly pleased this evening to be joined by His Grace Patrick O'Malley and Sir Haldor Thorhalson. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hello.
Thank you for
It's
having us.
Yeah, it's great to have you guys. Patrick, let's start with you real quick. Just kind of give us a quick history of your participation in the SCA and Kingdom of Caid.
I actually started when I was very young. I was 14 years old the first time I put on armor, and that was in 1977. Spent a long time, started pretty young, got involved very quickly, was around for the last couple of reigns of Caid as a principality, and then the creation of Caid as a kingdom, which involved a lot of people that I knew that were close friends of mine. The King of the West, when we became a kingdom, was a close friend and actually a Caid, and he was King of the West after when we became a kingdom, even though he still lived in Caid, and was pretty active, especially as a war fighter in the early days. My barony has always been very war focused. In the glory days of Estrella, we used to take 120 guys from the barony to Estrella, and had what I later learned kind of an unusual culture in the SCA, because our war bands were sometimes led by knights, but not always. At least 50% of the war bands were led by people who weren't knights, and it was, compared to other places in the SCA, kind of an odd thing. And so I spent the first decade or so primarily as a war fighter. I did tournament fighting. I thought I wanted, to be good at tournament fighting, but I really never put the work into it, as it were. It wasn't until the mid 90s that I really decided that I could do this, and decided to focus on the tournament field, as opposed to just building a war band to go out to Estrella and crush those evil Aiden-Delters, because that was always, the culture of the time in the good and bad old days of Estrella. So anyway, I went on, was knighted in 2003, was very intent in the tourney circuit, won crown the first time in 2009, and then in 2011, reign in 2012. And have been pretty active, and still pretty active in tournament fighting.
You had a pretty long, bit of history from when you joined and maybe when you started fighting to being knighted.
Mm-hmm. Very.
So how long after you joined? You were 14 in 1977. How long after that before you started fighting?
I started fighting immediately. In fact, on my 14th birthday, I went to a tournament, and a fighter who was later knighted, Sir Kamal Mishwakan, lives in DC these days, I think. Anyway, he got out of his armor at the end of the day of the tournament, and I was 14 years old and was perfectly happy to put his sweaty armor on and go out and let people swing sticks at me. So I was hooked from day one. I went home and started pounding a set of legs off an old street sign that I got from the city scrapyard, and cobbled together some really, really horrible armor, and have been fighting ever since.
It's amazing. So Haldar, how about you? Why don't you give us a brief history of your participation?
Yeah. So I found it in college back east. A bunch of friends that I was involved in for other nerd hobbies dragged me to this, thing I called a war, or they called a war, so I could hang out and drink. I thought it was pretty cool. Then they took me to an even bigger one, which was Penzic. So that sort of blew me away, and they dragged me out on a, misty morning where I was like, half puking, hung over, and then out of the mist, I see giant like armies of guys come and slam into each other, and that was my moment. I'm like, all right, whatever they're doing, next year I'm going to be here and do that. So I started as a war fighter. I started there, moved to the north of Caid, and I was in Kingdom for probably 5-6 years before I ever squired. And then I was a squire for a long time. I wasn't focused on getting the accolade right now. I just wanted to have fun, and that's still what I'm into. Like I'm an adequate tourney fighter. I've gotten third in crown, fourth in QC, but I'm a war dog at heart. And that was the culture in the North when I started, was a very baronial, um, like field guys for Estrella kind of culture. So I caught the tail end of the battle days that Duke Patrick mentioned, where like it felt like we were going to, Estrella for real, and we made sure that our helmets grounded out in case we got lifted off our face by a spear shot. Um, and and I must have done it well because I'm still here.
Awesome. Brendan,
Well, that that certainly speaks to my cold black Penzic heart, and I'm happy to have you both here. So, Haldor, you talked a little bit. I'm obviously from the east. I don't know the geography too much. You talked about the north of Caid. Where does that break down for our modern geographical senses?
Pretty much anything that's north of LA is the north.
Okay, great. Um, and where were you then during this time?
I started out in Nordvaca, which mundanely is Fresno, so that's about as north as you can go in Caid. And then I moved to North LA County, which is Lancaster, Palmdale, when I kind of started my mundane career, and that's where I still was when I got knighted.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. And
so
Patrick,
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I think you have a follow-up question, and then I'll move us into our decades.
Yep. I was just going to ask Patrick, where have you been geographically for your career with the society?
Well, I for most of my career, I've been in the very south of Caid, in the barony of Calafia, which is San Diego, close to the Mexican border, and have lived here most of my SCA career. There was some time when I was up farther north of Los Angeles, and Shire out on the coast, Shire. At that time, in the mid '80s, I was the fighter in the Shire. When I moved up there for work purposes, so I had to drive about an hour to get to the closest fighter practice at Sir Freewind's house before he was Sir Freewind up at Thousand Oaks. But then I moved back down to San Diego, and I've been here the whole time. I've been fortunate in that in the last 20 years I've traveled a lot for work, so I've been able to visit a lot of kingdoms and haul armor with me when I go for business and fight in a bunch of places. But I've been in the Principality and Kingdom of Caid effectively for all of my SCA time.
Great, thank you.
So a month ago, when we were lucky enough to do part one, we had the remarkably charismatic Duke Guy join us, and the absolutely charming Viscountess Larissa, and they were able to give us just a wonderful painting of the first 15, 20 years of Caid. And it was, we had a really great visit with them. But we covered, we covered the late 70s and we got through the 80s, and I think we got through the first part of the 90s. So we're going to start our look now from 1995 on, and let's take the late 90s and get us into the 2000s. The reigns at that period, if I'm not mistaken, and hopefully I'm not terribly mistaken because I am using Caid OP, but starting in November of 1995, there was King John II and Queen, is that Kainwan?
Yes.
Yep.
King Edric I and Queen Albra. Then King Dirk II and Queen Ariana II. Followed by King Joseph and Queen Caroline. Followed by King Rorik and Queen Karina. Followed by King Ivan IV and Queen Anastasia, or is that Anastasia?
Anastasia.
Yeah, normally pronounced Anastasia.
Then King Al-Tamiki II and Queen Luciana, or Luciana?
Luciana.
Luciana. King Friend, is that Francis?
Francis.
Francis. And Queen, oh, I'm going to terribly butcher this
Shawnee.
Shawnee, thank you. Irish persona, but I can't speak a lick of it. And then followed by King Edric II and Queen Batista. And then that finishes up with King Guillaume I and Queen Felina. So that is the period that we're looking at right now. And we're not by any means just looking at crown winners. But Crown Winners is a historical record of people who were winning big tournaments at that period. But you guys also, I mean, I don't know the history of, but I don't know when, Queen's Champion started. I know that's a pretty big tournament for you guys. And I don't know when it started or when it became a big deal. So if you guys know that, you could start with that, but that's just a starting off point for us to talk about this period in time. So, who were the players during the mid 90s? Why don't we start with you, Patrick?
For me, the mid 90s was an interesting time because I was coming off of a bunch of mundane stuff. I had a daughter and a layoff and lots of mundane things in the early 90s for me that really had me out of the tourney circuit. I mean, I was around, I got to the local events, but coming into the mid 90s was when I started deciding to come back and really get involved in tourney fighting. And so it was an interesting time because in the early 90s, there had been a shift in the calibration in Caid, as most kingdoms over decades go through ups and downs and what the calibration level is. And some of the people at the time were really pushing a lower calibration level. And so the calibration had changed. Unfortunately for me, at a time that I was not terribly active and had no idea this was going on. And I was, something of a brute apparently. But we had
It changed when you were taking a break. We can't really hold it against you too bad.
But it had consequences because I came back and locally, we had some local people that were kind of bruisers that it also had issues for them. But in particular, when Duke John was during his reigns, and John was a fantastic left-handed fighter with a side-mounted heater. Great fun to fight, and tended towards the lighter end of calibration that I had kind of missed the memo on. But he was certainly a big factor at the time. And then I was dealing with the Lancaster brothers locally, who became two of the three really active tournament fighters of the three brothers. Eventually were crowns in Caid. And the third one who to me was certainly the best trainer of the three and the most fun to watch fighting, George Lancaster. They were all very local in my local barony, so these are people I fought all the time. And they were not of the lighter, gentler persuasion. And so
Maybe they missed the memo too.
Yeah, they certainly didn't pass the information on to me.
Yeah, I I also think they wouldn't have cared about that memo.
There is that. But it was definitely a time when fighting in Caid was changing, and going through it had gone fairly low, worked its way up to a fairly high calibration. Many years later, I happened to be out in Anthropology for work, and I was at a local fighter practice, and I was talking to Duke Drake, and whenever I visit someplace else, trying to figure out, okay, what's local calibration, play at the local whatever. And he said, oh, I was in Caid for a while. I think we're about the same. And it quickly became evident that mostly because he decided he didn't want to be close to me. And so he led me on a chase around the park while I was trying to get into the range I wanted. And he kept tapping me in the arm. And I'm like, he keeps doing that. And I stopped and said, you keep doing that. Is that a good shot? And he said, well, yeah. I said, oh, okay. Not quite the same as home. And then I really found out that Drake had lived in Los Angeles in the early to mid 90s. In that time period when the calibration dropped, and specifically in the area where the people driving that adjustment and calibration lived. And it all made sense once I figured out what was going on, and I changed my calibration which was great until I ran into his squire, Sven, who hit me way harder than.
He's willing to play as hard historically as it can ever have been played.
And he hit me, and I'm like, oh, okay, different game. We'll play this game now. And fortunately for me, this was shortly after Sven got into the SCA, and I was able to mostly have my way with him that evening, which has not been the case since then.
Are we talking about Duke Sven Antir? Who are we talking about?
Duke Sven Anstiora.
Oh,
two stick.
Two stick.
Oh, he's been around that long?
No, this was much later. This was
okay.
Yeah, I don't remember when it was.
But I mean, I would like to kind of, I guess, dig into the whole changing of calibration. So, based off kind of what you've said here, pre mid 90s, there was a heavier calibration. So, is that something that started from the beginning? Is that a holdover from Western days? Were you guys heavier than the West? I mean, I'm just kind of trying to get a sense for where things were. And I got to tell you, hopefully you'll find this a little bit funny, but I mean, back in the 90s, I can remember an early 90s thing in Meridia's where we had like a sort of a slideshow thing. It was a lot like a Saturday Night Live news broadcast. And every so often they'd show something like a car wreck or whatever and go, is this a car wreck or a telling blow in Caid kind of a thing? And, so I'm not, I didn't know personally of any calibration issues. I always heard it like third, fourth hand and humorously at best. So it's very interesting to me to kind of get a sense for the history of calibration in a kingdom.
I think in the late 80s, or I'm sorry, early 80s, calibration, at least for me locally, was driven heavily by the plans for war at Estrella. And that was, people made weapons you didn't hit your friends with. It was pretty, and that was in the heyday of Duke Guy, who you had on last time. And Guy is, to say the least, not a light hitter.
No.
And there were definitely some powerhouse people in the early and mid 80s in Caid. And that was kind of what I SCA wise grew up with, and to a large extent because, I was fairly young, grew up with. And so when I had that time that I wasn't super active, that was what kind of got me in trouble. My first time really coming back, and really I had been practicing locally, and I went to Los Angeles because you had to go to Los Angeles in those days because San Diego was a backwater politically in the kingdom. And I went up to the first tournament in Los Angeles when I was getting serious about it, and Rorik was on the throne. And Rorik was a rock'em sock'em kind of wrestle around kind of guy. And I remember fighting him, and it was a PA, which, I was a war fighter. I hated the whole concept of the PA. It's like, all right, we'll stand here and talk when we get to fight. And I fought Rorik, and it was counted blows to 5. First person with 5 landed blows, and I was just going for it, and I was thrilled. I hit the king 3 times before he hit me the 5th time, and it was just all I had. And the very next fight, I fought somebody that I had known years before and thought he was a pretty top-notch tourney fighter, and I didn't realize that he had kind of taken a step back. And I went after him like I had gone after the king. And when I was up 3-0, I had a brief thought that I should probably back off, but I didn't. And I didn't pay much attention to the politics of the SCA at the time, and apparently Knights Council was the next day. And I got feedback the next week that I was too intense. Like, oh, I know where that fight was. But yeah, I think there was definitely in the 80s. It was at least where I was. It was definitely a hard hitting, rock'em sock'em kind of fight going on, and that may vary in the kingdom. The kingdom was much more. There were local groups in the kingdom that may have had different tracks as far as calibration and fighting styles. It was a little more isolated, even for a small kingdom as Caid is. In the 80s, everyone said, oh, Califians don't travel. So people from San Diego don't come to LA. And, a friend of mine that eventually got knighted well before I did, somebody asked him, what does it take to become a knight? And his answer was a good car. Because it wasn't going to happen if you stayed in San Diego.
Now, this change in calibration that we've been talking about, is this something that's driven by taste? Is it something that's driven by injury? Is it what's really driving it, to the best of your knowledge?
I kind of wasn't there when it went downward. I think it was mostly taste. I think there were a couple of people who were very influential fighters at the time and crown winners at the time, who were very talented fighters, and their preference was a lighter calibration. And I think that was more that than anything. I never heard of any injury issues. And and some of those people are still around today, and they still prefer that lighter fight. I mean, I had, one of them come up to me within the last decade, some tournament we were going to fight, and he had watched my prior round fight and came up to me and said, hey Patrick, you don't have to hit me that hard. I'm like, cool.
Yeah, and it wouldn't surprise me if it was also just a point of, differentiating us from the West, which had done the opposite at the time, which had gone from a fairly normal calibration to, like up there with Atlantia at the time. The West was very, very hard hitting at the time.
And
where do you I'm sorry, where do you guys think you are now?
All over the map.
Honestly, and not so much in the last few years, COVID and all, but I've had the opportunity to be up and down the West Coast periodically for work, and I think the West Coast has become relatively homogenous. I think the calibration from the Mexican border to the Canadian border on the West Coast is reasonably even. And you'll find pockets here and there, and you'll find some individuals here and there. But on the average, I think you can fight in San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, on up to Seattle, and be in the same general ballpark. Enough people travel back and forth that I think things have evened out a lot compared to what they were in the 80s and 90s.
Your thoughts, Haldor?
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of the better fighters, there's definitely a pretty good understanding of what makes a good blow. But when you get into the war fighters and into the outlying areas, then I think there's a lot of people that are sort of all over the map. So it's an interesting time to be a fighter. You kind of got to feel out what the other person is expecting.
Well, I know from an outsider kind of looking in, and you have to take sort of my observations with a grain of salt, 2 grains of salt, really. I mean, one, I'm especially fond of light calibrations myself, and people have a tendency to, I guess, lend strawberry power to some of my shots. Because when I visited Caid or fought you at wars and stuff, I find you to be solidly in the middle, the average of the SCA. I mean, there's a couple guys that really want to be blasted, but there's a couple guys that want to be blasted in every kingdom. And, there were a couple of guys that I thought were, right on the sort of the little lower than average. So, I definitely now don't see you guys as being an outlier in any way with your calibration, but that could just be what I see at war. And it could be, again, that people are really polite and take my relatively light shots.
Your shots come in so fast, I never felt they were light. They sting a lot.
I kind of go for that. The sting rather than the break.
Yeah. There was in the early 2000s, I was at a fighter practice in Indianapolis. And while I was arming up, my wife was out talking to people. And she overheard a conversation about how this guy's from Caid and you need to hit him really hard. And so the first thing I did when I came back from the parking lot, my armor said, "Hey guys, you don't have to hit me really hard. Really, I'm fine."
Well, good. I'm going to steal Brennan's one of his favorite questions. So tell me a little bit what training is like during this period. Are there pockets of training, or is there sort of a kingdom, sort of educational program where people are working on their prowess in either class structures or or just sort of the household / baronial kind of thing? What's it look like? We'll start with Haldor.
Yeah. The North at the time was very baronial. All of our knights got along really well. So, wherever you had gas money to go, you would be welcomed at any practice. If we had enough guys to do, any kind of like small scenarios or drills, we would do it. But I mean, given the people we had, it was mostly a lot of it was mostly a lot of one-on-one fighting and small drills. Francis, who was later king, was really good at coming up with stuff for us to do. So we would like lay two glaives on the ground to like mimic a spear line, and we would practice spear line battles. We would practice pulse charges. So at least in the North, it was pretty organized for the SCA. And I imagine in the South, it was even more organized, Patrick.
It was very organized in the South, as long as you're talking about war fighting. It was a very war fighting oriented for me, especially all in the far South in Calafia. Like I said, at late 90s, we were taking 120 guys to Estrella. Our monthly war practice usually had 70 fighters at it. And it was all about the war bands and training against each other. Tournament fighting wise, much less emphasis on individual training. I was squired to Balin of Tor, who was the architect of the Caid and Estrella army in the rough old days of Estrella. And he trained with me individually, tournament fighting, up until the point where I started hitting him, and then he got busy with the army. And we didn't have a lot of structured one-on-one tournament fighting kind of training down here. Even into the 2000s, I mean, I mostly went to fighter practice, fought the best fighters there, went home and tried to figure out what they did to me. There wasn't a lot of good instruction. There were a few people that probably were good instructors. For me personally, I never had somebody that really gave me structured instruction like we see today locally. Training is much different now than it was then, at least in my experience. And I don't know in other parts of the kingdom how that went, how much individual training was happening in the Los Angeles area or in the north, the Kingdom of North Los Angeles and Central Valley. I saw those people at tournaments. Francis, that Haldar mentioned, he and I were two of the last three in Crown Tournament in '99, and Francis and I were both unbelts. And Tamiki was Crown at the time and had made everything after, I think, third round in Crown Great Weapon. And I was decent at the time with the Great Sword, and Francis was very good with the glaive. And I think they didn't do that again for a while. The one knight who was left in the tournament, I think it was
Gavin.
Yeah. He had the buy-in to the final, and Francis and I fought it out. And I've been very thankful to this day that Francis beat me. There are a great many pitfalls to being an unbelted Crown, and it was the first time I had fought for my lady and current wife, and she was on the sidelines with no color in her face, thinking I don't have garb for this. I wasn't expecting this, and it was a very, very good day to lose for me in the long run of my SCA career, and a very rough day for Francis, who went on to win it and had a very difficult reign. And probably,
Well,
if anything,
this whole Great Weapon thing after the third round is very Tamiki.
Yeah, it was, especially at the time. He had
on brand.
Uh-huh.
I didn't know that he did that with his list, but I'm not surprised.
He did. It did not happen again for a while. I think there were some people that were not thrilled with the 2 out of 3 unbelts in the final 3 of Crown Tournament. and I did not end up into the last rounds of Crown Tournament for some years after that.
Is a final 3 a common occurrence for y'all? I feel like I've seen that more coming out of Caid crowns than I see coming out of ours.
And I don't know what drives that list wise, but certainly we've had it a fair number of times and had various ways. My first Crown win came down to a final 3, and the way we handled that at that particular time was the first fighter to win 2 fights in a row was Crown. And I was fortunate in winning the first 2 fights and didn't have to prolong that, but it could have gone on all afternoon.
Is that the product of not having or moving people around in brackets from one bracket to the next or whatever? Because I mean, in a lot of where I'm from, they would consider a standard list. There would be a bracket that starts with everybody, and if you lost, you moved over into an elimination bracket. So it would be impossible to get a 3-way tie at the end, because there's always going to be a winner of the first bracket and a winner of the second bracket.
Yeah, we've never done brackets. It's always a straight double elimination, which makes it much easier. So it's random generally, and there are exceptions, there have been exceptions over the years, but generally it's random double elimination. So if you start out with an odd number, it's easy to end up with an odd number. And we've had various ways of dealing with that. We've had, in some cases, there's been a clear case where one person was clean to the finals undefeated and the other people had losses. And so that person was given the bye to the final, and the 2 with losses fought it out. We've had to where the first person to have 2 victories in a row was crowned. And we've also had the first person who lost 2 fights in a row was eliminated, and then we had the finals. Both of those can go quickly, or you can spend a while seeing who has the endurance to make it to the end.
I think that's definitely a eastern part of the map versus western part of the map difference. The 3-way tie for anything is just, I didn't even know there was such a thing till I came out west.
It's interesting to me, like, even the language is a little bit different. Like clean, the language of clean versus
Clean.
Undefeated.
Yeah.
It's just these little differences that make our game for me. Because this show ultimately for me, and I think I'll speak for Aeladon, is just us nerding out on SCA traditions and interkingdom anthropology.
Very
Um,
cool.
so, so thinking about this, you said there is not much training going on that's formalized in terms of singles.
In the late 90s, yes.
Yeah, at this time. When does that change?
For me, locally, I think that changed in the late, between 2000 2010. I saw more of a shift in that. And that just may have been me being aware of it, because that was the time where I actively became a trainer. And
Okay.
I had several people that I was training before I was knighted, um, all the trials and tribulations leading to getting knighted. Duke Guillaume told me that I had squires hanging from my knight's belt when I got knighted, because I had people I'd been training. Um, and one of those is a knight today. But I had been actively training in the late 90s, 2000-ish. And at least in my perception, that became more common from that time on. And certainly, just for me personally, when I was knighted, I felt an obligation to train people, which I didn't receive a lot of. Most of my training was go to fighter practice, get hit, go home, figure out how they hit me, and see if I could duplicate it. There were things from various of the Lancaster brothers, especially George, was a big influence on my fighting. And he'd throw shots at me, and I would go home. And he didn't so much teach me the shots. It was before I really experienced him as a teacher, and he was a great teacher. He passed away a year ago. But I would go home and try and duplicate the things that he had done. And the end result of that was I developed similar shots to his, but with different mechanics, because I stood at the pel until I made them work. And then the things I made work are what I taught. So they aren't quite the same, but they're very close, because that was where the inspiration came from.
Yeah, and I mean, at the time, we had several amazing tourney fighters. I mean, Tamiki, when he won crown, was just unstoppable, and Edric was beautiful and fluid.
And Ivan,
Yeah, yeah, and Ivan was precise. Like, he never had the greatest hand speed, but he got it done. And so, I mean, when you're rolling around and seeing guys like that, like, it's hard not to be inspired. Like, even if you're like, oh, I'm a war dog, I don't really care about this. Like, when you see guys like that, you're like, okay, I want to hit the pel and see if I can develop like a beautiful off leg shot. Now that I've seen it done.
So, on our banners, we had it said special guest. So, they're able to join us now, coming in live from the Pacific Northwest. Let's bring in His Grace Duke Mansur. Let's drag his thing up here. Add to stream. There we go.
Hey guys,
Hey, brother.
Your Grace, hey.
Welcome
to the
aboard,
stream.
sir.
how's it going? How are y'all doing?
And how are
tonight?
you today?
Good.
Are you
good.
okay
Just,
having
checking the hotel here.
had to suffer Hawaii like you did?
Oh
made me
yeah,
jealous.
yeah, it was awful. I tell you, terrible, terrible time.
Very quickly,
So
why don't you
about
tell
the
us what you just got through doing, because that sounded like a lot of fun. And then we'll ask you a little bit about Caid.
Oh yeah, so Count Octamasades and his friends from Wakuk arranged a little meet and beat in the Barony Western Seas on Oahu. So yeah, it was about 6 or 7 or so fighters from Wakuk came out. A few fighters from Montier were there. The most of the fighters from Maui were there as well. So, and then Western Seas decided to have a Western Seas anniversary the same day. I think it was the 50th anniversary. Uh, so yeah, so it was a
Super
good
cool.
time. We had a blast. It was my first time on Oahu, so I got some sightseeing in while I was there. You know, and ate a lot of poke, like you do.
So what we're able to do with His Grace Patrick and Sir Haldar was we asked a little bit about, you know, getting your start in the Kingdom of Caid. You know, what years was that? How
Hmm.
old were you? And such. So why don't you, if you would, just give us a little bit of your history in Caid, so that our guests feel like they know you like we do.
Yeah, sure. So I I went to college starting in '98. It was UC San Diego, and early on in my days on campus, I was walking around with a friend, and we hear this really loud clacking sound. And we're like, "What the heck is that?" And we uh, we go over to the kind of the main student center where like all the restaurants are and stuff. There's like a big plaza in the middle, and there's these guys fighting with what looked like kendo swords, and we were very intrigued. So we go up to them, ask them what they're doing, and they were, you know, uh, exactly what we thought they were, hitting each other with kendo sticks. And then it turns out, talking to them, that they're all in this group called the SCA. And so those became my friends my freshman year. And then I think a year or two later, one of them said, "Hey, Sharif might be interested in fighting in armor." And I was like, "Ooh, what's this armor thing you're talking about? That sounds like fun." And I think it wasn't until like my junior or senior year when I had a little bit of my own money to actually use to buy armor that I went and tried it out. I think it was 2001 was my first time in armor. So I had been familiar with the SE for a few years, just didn't really have a chance to join, and I was focusing on my classes until I was just about wrapping up. So I think 2001 was when I got in armor and got authorized, and that was my went to my first fought my first SCA event, which was Betrayal War. Um, and let me think. So pretty much for the first year and a half or so, I pretty much was just a warfighter. I fought. We had the Iron Brigade, the Bernie Calfia's war band, a war unit, the Iron Brigade. They had a monthly practice, and so I pretty much just got an armor for that practice for the first year and a half. So I went to a few, mostly just wars. Went to a few Pachero wars, um, and then a couple of Great Westerns. But I was doing armored combat in wars, but I was still like fighting in tourneys Chennai, and um, and then so the next Great Western War, 2002, is when I met the man who would become my knight, Gamil, who wasn't a knight yet, but he kind of pushed me in the direction of tourney fighting. So I think at that war, 2002, is when I fought my first tourney size shield. And then the following week was it what's the one with the ice flows, Patrick? Is it Leif Erikson?
Leif Erikson.
Yeah.
Leif Erikson, yeah, that's it. Yeah, so that was my first tourney. Like, 'cause it's like a bear pit tourney, and then they do this fun ice flow melee afterwards, where if you step off an ice flow, you're dead. So it gets really violent, as you might expect. Um, it was really fun to send people flying through the air ropes and stuff. And then I think a few weeks later was my first like standard double M tourney, which was Caliphate anniversary. And so that was pretty much my start of my tourney fighting. Gamil was knighted. When was he knighted? I think he was knighted the following. Was he knighted that year? I don't remember exactly. At some point, he got knighted, and I squired to him. And then basically, I got knighted after 3 full seasons of tourney fighting. So it was. So I started tourney fighting in 2000, Calify Anniversary 2002. I got knighted at the same event in 2005.
Yeah. If
So,
you don't mind my jumping in, I remember
sure.
your first downtown tourney. you went to the 5th or 6th round and you beat Edric, who had just stepped down. And I remember and I remember seeing you, and I'm like, I'm gonna be calling this guy sir long before he's gonna be calling me sir back.
Yeah, that was Angel's anniversary.
Correct.
Yeah, so yeah, you're right. I remember that fight with Edric. I threw a couple of fakes, and then I one-shotted him under the armpit. And then I also beat Earl Gar in that tourney, and I had like what felt like the longest fight ever with Count Joseph. So yeah, that was a good tourney for me. And had a really good fight with Helgi, who I think he was knighted by that point. But yeah, that was kind of one of the first tourneys. I was like, wow, I feel like I'm doing pretty good. So
Well, we appreciate you doing really good and joining us here this evening. And we've been talking for a while about the second half of the 90s. We're going to wrap that up with my favorite part of the show: who won this period. So we've talked about the late 90s, so I think we'll limit the scope of this question to sort of 95 to 99, 2000, and ask who won that period. And and you get to define that criteria however you want. Patrick, I'll start with you, please.
In my mind, the man to beat in that period was Ivan the Illustrated. He was the monster. Everybody was. I can remember Conrad, who was a monster on his own, Conrad Breakring, walking out on a tourney field before he was in his prime. And I had watched Conrad many times, and Conrad was a force to be reckoned with, 2 swords, and just would maul people. And he walked out into a conflict with Ivan, and it was like somebody else walked on the field. Conrad was not there, and whoever was there was afraid of Ivan. Ivan was still in his head. That all changed much later, and now Dave's in Conrad's head. But I watched the force of will that was Ivan at the time change the fighter that walked onto the field against him just because of who he was. He was in my mind the person to beat in the late 90s.
All right. I'm sorry. Haldor, what's your thoughts on who won that period?
Tamiki, when he trained for the Caid crown that he won, absolutely unstoppable. Just like more fluid than any guy his size has any right to be. Like he would fight people with great weapons, and they would swing at him. Like it looked like he would step through their weapon like Jedi style and then hit them across the back. Like might be some of the best SCA fighting I've ever seen.
Awesome. And last but certainly not least, our special guest, Menser.
So, I joined in, like I said, 2001. So I did not play during the 90s. But
Perfectly fair to use a legendary status. I mean,
Yeah.
I have an idea of who was important in Meridier's in the 70s, and, I wasn't playing. I just have this idea based on stories. So you're welcome to pick a winner based on, the vibes you got from other people talking.
Well, the vibes as far as kind of who was as far as fighting prowess goes, and I'd heard a lot about him, but never met him, and then I saw him fight, and I was like, oh wow, okay, that's what everyone's talking about. That would have been Dirk. He was one hell of a fighter. So, and then I saw him fight, and I was like, oh, that's what everyone's talking about. Okay. And he was at my local, at our local fighter practice, and getting to fight him repeatedly was something that really, forced my fighting to evolve. So.
Outstanding.
Cool.
Well, so we have a winner. My little add to the, I really don't know what Tamiki's influence was early in Caid, but just from having watched fighters my whole life, in my mind, Tamiki in his prime is the best SCA fighter we've ever had. And, I don't necessarily mean the most knowledgeable or the best trainer, or, I mean, even though he's outstanding in all those things, I've just seen him do things that I've not seen anyone else be capable of doing. Just remarkable, remarkable things. I actually, I legitimately pity people who did not get to watch Tamiki fight in his prime.
I always felt
Yeah,
that way.
They don't have a memory that we do.
I
I
wish
always
I
felt
got
that
to
way
see.
about Radnor in the West.
I wish I got to see Tamiki fight in his prime.
Yeah, there's a video I can send you that's after his prime, where he steps to the side and throws a wrap shot. I've slowed it down. It's 3/1000ths of a second. Like, there's a video of him throwing a wrap shot faster than the punch Muhammad Ali knocked out Sonny Liston with.
Wow.
I know it's hearsay, but I was on my way to, I used to go to Lily's War to basically goof off and not really participate in the war all that much. I'd fight some, but I goofed off a lot. And I went to lunch every day. So I'd walk to my car with people, and we'd just go somewhere and have lunch. But I was walking by the fighting field, seeing him doing pickups, and whatever, he was fighting Sword and Shield in this particular fight, and someone got the best of him and put him in a bad situation and threw a shot for him, about shoulder level. And he was out of position. He couldn't block it. So he just threw himself backwards and bent at the waist and basically went all the way back to where the shot it just whiffed. And then from that position where it looked like his head and shoulders was about his butt level, he leapt in the air and threw a scorpion wrap and hit the guy in the back. And, I'm just standing there with my buddy going, did you just see? He's like, did you just see what I saw? I'm like, yeah, let's go get lunch. We can't, it's too much. So that's our look at 95, 2000. And again, I'm gonna run through the people who won the next crowns and their reigns, with the caveat that again, it's only one indicator of sort of who were players at this time. There are people there's always a fighter in every kingdom who didn't fight in crown at that period who's a player at that point. There are people who've never won crown, who've never fought in crown, who are some of the best fighters in the SCA. So I don't mean to try to be royalty centric in this notion. I'm certainly while I have an affinity for it because I've done it, I also know it's not the end all to be. It's not actually even an indicator of best fighter. It just best fighter in that tournament that day, normally. So that said, in November of 2000, we had the reign of King Ivan V and Queen Carolus. Then that was followed by King Alaric I and Queen Kissa, and that's Alaric the transplant from Atlantia, I believe.
Yep.
Then you had King Edric III and Queen Catalina, King Guillaume II and Queen Felina II, followed by King Gerhard and Queen Una, followed up by Alaric II and Queen Carinsa. And that's followed up by Dirk III and Queen Levana, which is followed up by King Brand and Queen Nuala. And that's, we're almost done. I got to get through 10. Dirk IV and Queen Charmaine. and then finally King Dietrich III and Queen Adriana II. And that takes us to the basically 2005. So that's your next 10 crowns. Let's take a kind of a look at that period. And the first thing I'd like to ask is there anything changing at this point from late 90s fighting training to early 2000s fighting training? Is there any new influences within the kingdom? Are there any new shield styles, weapon styles, any things like that? So let's just why don't we start with Haldar and get your thoughts and observations on this period.
Yeah, this is the reign of the center punch shield. Also, people are starting to use their low pro thrusting tips, and like everybody's doing singles now. Like day tourneys are the thing. The war culture's past. Estrella, like we're sort of still a principle, but it's not a driving part of the kingdom. The West on-tier war is kaput or nearly kaput. We're now a fast hands day tourney kingdom.
And what changes that drives that?
Like the we just don't have an enemy anymore. We don't have like the, we're not that excited about Estrella. The West Caid War is mostly kaput, and the exciting thing is the giants we have on the tourney field. It's yeah.
I'll throw this out there, and you guys can tell me if it sounds right to you. I had heard that around this period, Aidenvelt got really hyper focused on winning to the point that it was starting to make the war unfun for the participants, and as such, it started to suffer a little bit.
That was certainly a perception from our end of things, and I can remember going into this period and a little later, having kind of some back channel conversations with people in Aidenvelt. This is when people started not going to Aidenvelt, when there started to be a lot of political tensions over it. And you could go to any of the surrounding kingdoms around Aidenvelt, and you can debate the causes of this and whether it was accurate or not. But if you went to the Outlands or the West or Caid or up to Artemisia, you could ask any rank and file fighter what's rule number one at Estrella, and they would all tell you rule number one is Aidenvelt wins.
Yeah.
And that really drove a lot of people away from that war. And there were people actively trying to fix it, and there were a few people who had that mindset. And at the time, some of the people that really had that mindset were the really hot sticks in Aidenvelt who were winning crowns and driving all of that. And so there was a lot of conflict at the time. And at that time, we had probably one of the best in terms of individual fighting prowess groups of people coming up in Caid. I mean, we had some really good one-on-one fighters. This is the time period when Dirk really took firm control of, beating Dirk was a trick. Dirk was a phenomenal fighter for all of his problems, and he's no longer part of the SCA as a result of his issues. He was an amazing fighter, and I've had a few people over the years say, "Oh, Dirk didn't take shots." So that's 100% was never the case. Dirk would always take your shots if you could manage to hit him. Hitting him was a trick, and his timing and precision was amazing to watch. And I had
range control.
Yeah,
Dirk. Yeah, just an unbelievable fighter.
And he wasn't the only one. We had a bunch of them. This was at the time period when Guillaume won his crowns. Guillaume de la Belgique as a duke. Very different fighter, finesse, nowhere near that level of calibration, but a very precise mechanical technique fighter, extremely accurate. Somebody else that I fought with a lot, that drove a lot of my fighting. It's still a good friend today. He was, as I mentioned offline earlier, he was out riding my horse this afternoon. So
So while Mansur's
I think I'm good to
internet,
go. I think.
while his internet is helping, hotel internet, you got to love it. But while it's stable for a few minutes, what are your perceptions for this period of time? This is around the same time as you really got going, and during this period, you also got knighted. So, you were having to see a lot of these fighters that were, making a name for themselves and who were stepping up in the early 2000s. So, what are your perceptions at this period?
Yeah, so I excuse me. I feel really lucky that this was kind of when I was really starting to, get into fighting and really sharpen my skills. Like the Calafia fighter practice was amazing. Uh, if I'm not fighting Dirk or one of his brothers, especially George, oh my God, I'm fighting Patrick, I'm fighting Valeric, Drogo, Guillaume. The guy who became my knight would come down, Camille, um, and just really top heavy practice. There were no slouches in that fighter practice. Um, and then beyond that, this was when Duke Dietrich he hadn't won a crown. I think he won a crown in 2005, but he was pushing hard in every crown during this period and going really deep. So was Sven Slothboy. He didn't win until '06, I think, but he was.
That's my knight.
Yeah, yeah. So he was still going really deep. So guys who weren't quite winning yet, but were winning every other tourney outside of crown. But yeah, just like Patrick said, Dirk, man, oh my God, I had never, I'd never seen him not take a shot, but good luck hitting him.
Yeah.
He only lost one. He won 5 crowns, and he only lost one fight in those crowns, and that was because he was doing the Troy stuff, and Camille took his arm, and it was just a fluke. And then Dirk made him pay for it in the final.
Yikes.
So, just yeah, and people in like every, he has all the attributes of a fighter that Patrick and Haldor talked about, but I think one thing that really stood out to him about me was his mind for fighting. Every single time I fought him, nothing that I was able to hit him with before worked again. You hit him with something, and he just shuts it down. It will never work again. So you're constantly trying to think outside the box. And I'd find myself in the middle of the fight, like coming up with things on the fly, like weird pump fakes and stuff and false steps, just to try to get him to bite on something. Because if you just stand in front of him and throw a shot, he's going to block it. So you're constantly chaining things together, trying to figure out how to get, in his guard, while at the same time, not getting your head taken off. And then I mentioned his brother George, who passed last year. He was another big influence. Who's someone who, he didn't fight in tourneys much, but he was at fighter practice a lot. And just, man, we say like Dirk was an amazing fighter. George was a genius swordsman, right? The things he could do, yes, the things he could do with the blade, I've yet to see anyone else do. Just unbelievable. He could stand in front of you and hit you in the butt with the back blade. Just in a split second, and you have no idea how he did it. Just a genius. So those are my winners.
Awesome. And then I guess, Your Grace Patrick, we've not asked you yet about this period.
I think I started it.
Oh, you know what? I may have just zoned
but
out.
there are so many in this time period. There were so many great fighters that came out of this time period.
Yeah.
This was when Sven Offender, the Caid Duke Sven of the plethora of Duke Svens, was really coming on strong, and he's such a unique fighter that you have to learn to fight Sven because he's not like any other lefty. He's just weird. But
So you have all this homegrown stuff that you guys have got in, and then George moves into Kingdom, and he has to be a little bit of a weird kind of style for what you guys have got going on at the time.
God, he was fast.
I would think.
I think he was a weird outlier no matter where you were, just like because of his racket sport experience. He had 4 or 5 shots, but they were unbelievably fast, and he could throw them at every conceivable angle. Just interesting fighter. I still like the guy today. Still shows up occasionally. Lives in the West somewhere.
He'd have been a bigger influence here, I think. He was an influence here. He and I fought a lot before he was knighted, because he moved here before being knighted. And then after he got knighted, and then he won crown twice here, and at the end of his second reign, moved out of Kingdom. And had he stayed here, I think he'd have been a much bigger influence on Caid and fighting. He moved on and was an influence elsewhere. And he was the what name did he use on Armor Archive? He always put odds out for crown under a pseudonym.
Apprentice.
I remember those days.
I remember reading. I was like, all right, I'm not reading my odds that he's putting out before crown.
Now, I mean, you look at the list of people who are winning crown. Was there anyone not winning crown at this point? Obviously, you guys are talking about George Lancaster, someone who's influential, who isn't winning crown in this period. Is there anyone else that's really standing out also, or anyone sort of stepping up at this period? And maybe we'll see their names when we look at the next half decade.
Yeah, Sven, Sven Dog, Sloth Boy, offhand.
And
sure.
You were my dark horse that I thought was going to win crown before you did.
It took me a while to figure it out, get my headspace working.
Yeah, Edward the Sinister was starting to come on. Like we were just loaded with good lefties at the time.
All very unique too. I always used to say you had to learn to fight each of them. Learning to fight a lefty didn't specifically help you with any one of them. Mansour had his own style, and nothing that worked on Mansour worked against Sven or worked against Ed. And the same all the way around. There were just 3 completely different fights, and you just had to go learn each of them.
It's always really cool. And I think I've fought most of those guys, and I definitely would say that they stepped beyond the, being lefty good to just being good. And, it's always great when they do that, because you'll see a fair number of left-handed fighters who excel and then kind of just sort of peter out because they never really learned or thought about fighting from fighting perspectives. They just rode, the being left-handed trick, which is a great trick. But I think all 3 of those guys, rose above that and learned how to fight and, just became fighters, not left-handed fighters. They just became fighters.
I think that brings us into the second half of the decade, unless you were going somewhere else, Eleanor.
And that's exactly where I was going to go. I was going to see if I can make my way through the list real quick of crown winners and reigns. So starting in November of 2005, it looks like it's King Dirk V and Queen Shemaine. Then Sven I and Queen Kofina. Yay, kitty. Then King Edric IV and Queen Faiza. Followed by King Drogo and Queen Iuna. Followed by King Edric V and Queen Faiza. Followed by King Edward I and Queen Mora. followed by Sven II and Queen Kolfina II. Yay, Kitty, again. And then Edward II, Queen Mora II, some fella by the name of Patrick and Queen Cara, and then Conrad I and Queen Eleanor. So that rounds out our 2000s. It's a good place to launch off our conversation. And why don't we jump in with Monsieur, since we've got a really good internet connection going.
Yeah, so
And just let me say, you're not limited to talking about those people.
okay.
It's the period.
Well, right. So, well, I'd say that I mean, starting just briefly with the people who won the crowns, you're hearing Edward Sinister's name a lot. You're hearing Edric's name a lot, and them and Sven were kind of like the three fighters who seemed to just win most of the tournaments. And this was also when Patrick was really pushing hard for crown and really going deep in pretty much every crown he fought in, except for I think the year where you were out with after blowing your ACL, which was fight. So Patrick, destroys his knee, gets it rebuilt, and I think he just spent like a year doing pel work, right? And he came back better than ever, and then beat everybody. Let me think, who else? Who else did we have in there? That was a good 5 years because I felt like there were just a lot of fighters who were just pushing really hard. Like Valeric is one. Valeric only won crown recently, but he was going deep in crowns too. He finaled with Patrick in the crown. Patrick won. So sorry, it was a while ago. I'm trying to think of who else we got. Yeah, I think that's
Ragnar.
Yeah, Ragnar. So you finaled with Ragnar on that crown, the first crown. Was he in that three-way final?
That was a three with me
Yeah,
and Valeric.
that's right.
Ragnar's the guy who finaled a bunch and never got to win.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then he finaled against you your second reign.
Yeah.
And then he finaled against me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He also finaled in a crown against Edward the Sinister, I believe, and was like fighting, but like didn't want to tell anybody his rib was broken. That happened, didn't it?
Well, he chipped a bone off of his shoulder when he was fighting me, and had to. So his arm was in a sling for my reign.
Okay, but he
I don't remember the rib though.
Yeah, it was at a crown in like Darrock that Edward the Sinister won. One of the three. I remember it because I was there, and then I found out later his rib was messed up.
That was when I was out of the country for.
Okay.
Oh, who did Ed? I don't remember who Ed finaled against.
So culturally, when we think about fighting, not just who's winning, but when we talked about the last period, we talked about this was the era where the punch shield and the low profile tips come into vogue, and you go from an Estrella focused kingdom to a tournament kingdom. What's happening with the culture of fighting in these next 5 years? Anything big changing here? Shield styles that are starting to dominate, things like that?
I think this is when the center boss shields really kind of took over. A lot of that was driven by Dirk. This was also the time period, and we kind of missed in the previous 5 years. One of the real influential people was Conrad Breakring, who comes up at the end of this one, winning crown. Conrad was just a monster with two swords. I mean, and super hard hitting. I mean, if you hear about talk of Caid people hitting real hard, there was Conrad, to the point where it was kind of an issue occasionally for him. People were unhappy with how hard he was hitting. But then later on, in the era we're talking about now, Conrad ended up switching from two stick to sword and shield. I think he had some injuries involved, and he kind of took a little transition time. But when he came out with the center grip sword, and again the center grip shield, which was becoming very popular at the time, he came back really powerful with a much more, I don't know if it was a more dynamic fight. It was a very different fight than when he was a two-stick fighter. And, two-stick fighters have always been a challenge for me. And I could remember going out and fighting in two-stick and just getting beaten to a pulp because I was determined I wasn't going to give up. I was going to find a way to fix it, mostly not successfully. But I think, I think most of those trends, at least in this kingdom, I presume other kingdoms, when people start winning crown with something, all of a sudden it becomes popular. So for a while in this period, Edric was winning crown with a Madhu. And so we had a little bloom of Madhu fighting in Caid. And Madhu has never been a Caidan thing. But in that period, it kind of had a flare of, this guy's winning crown with Madhu, we should all pick up Madhus with the would-be up-and-coming fighters.
Are you guys still kind of a center grip kingdom? I know one trend that started was Haldar brought up in the previous section, which was low profile thrusting tips. Man, those things caught like wildfire, and they're never going away. I mean, I can't even imagine going back to what we did before.
The Q-tips.
Trailer hitch balls. The trailer hitch ball covers that set on the top end of the shield or swords.
Yeah.
Ugh.
So in this time period, thrusting became the thing. Everybody was, it was like sewing machines out there. For a lot of the newer fighters coming up was, in my mind, a detriment because they were losing sword skill. The only skill they had was thrusting. And we had a huge crop of people that the only thing they could do was thrust. And I came from outside the SCA. I did a lot of fencing, not really in the SCA. And it's funny, I never used a thrusting tip in the SCA because I didn't want that big blob of foam on the end of my sword. I don't even want the small blob of foam on the end of my sword.
What it did to the balance of your sword was insane mad. I could not do
I
it.
hated it. And I've always fought with an appropriately balanced sword, like a historic sword. I want it close to my hand. I want it, 3 to 4 inches from my hand. And that never worked with the thrusting tip. And I'm a blade fighter in the SCA. I don't tend to use thrusting tip, and I want the end of my sword to be hard because when the corner of that sword hits you in the chest, I want it to not be a piece of foam. I want it to deliver. So I've never used them, and in fact, because of all that was going on, and everybody was just thrusting like mad, and a lot of the newer fighters were not developing good sword skills. When I won crown, at the crown following that, I said there'll be no single-handed thrusting in crown tournament, which, and I announced that the day I stepped.
Oh, how Michael Bedford of you!
I made some.
I was perfectly okay with it because I don't fight with a thrusting tip either.
We have a norm here. I wouldn't say it's prevalent, but it's not unheard of either, where we take a lot of our newer folks and don't have them have a tip for just that reason. Is that something y'all are doing at this point or subsequently?
A lot of people have done that, not systemically. I mean, it's not, but a lot of knights with their squires or people they're training in Caid will say, losing the thrusting tip for now.
Yep.
Have it back.
That's what I always did. Yeah.
Great.
And I actually, when I do pel work, I practice thrusts on the pel, even though I don't have one on my sword, just because it's still fun, and I put one on when I fight war.
I use them in war. I don't use them in tourney.
I'll never take them off my swords again. I use them for setting range and for faking openings to get openings up. I may legitimately thrust someone 1 in 30, 40, 50 shots, but I will set up everything with it. It's really good for that. Really good for setting range. Funny
Yeah,
what
but
putting
your
putting
range is a foot and a half out of mine.
Same.
Same.
So this looks like a really exciting period. I know most of these names, and the ones that I don't know, I've heard stories of and tales of. So this is I think for the 2000s to the 2010s is just an exciting period of prowess growth for Caid. Just you know, taking some of the things that you learned when you were thuggish, or more hard hitting and hard taking, to adding all the skill and talent and speed and thoughts and practice and training. It really seems like it just sort of bloomed in this decade to a really nice level of a great, of good singles prowess going on. I hate that it took maybe not being so war focused or having a war to focus on to do that, but it's really cool that it happened anyway. It's silver lining. So we should accelerate ourselves a little bit just because we're going to run out of time this evening. So Brendan, why don't you take us into your favorite portion, and I'll get ready to start thinking about the next decade. So let's put a pin in this one.
Great. So, who won 2000 to 2010? In this, we're starting with the reign of King Ivan V and running all the way through Conrad and Eleanor. And again, it does not have to be who won the most crowns. It is define this for yourself. Who won the decade? Monster, we'll start with you, please.
Dirk, like that's the top name that is ringing in my head for that era. The best and the most influential.
Great. Haldor, what are your thoughts?
Lefties. This was the heyday of the lefties.
I love it. A
Good
group
answer.
winner.
Good answer. I like that one.
All right,
I
Patrick.
would have to go. I don't know. I think in terms of influencing tournament fighting in Caid, I would have to go Dirk, but also Edric was a huge factor, and on the outside of fighting, on the social side of thing, Edric was a bigger influence. But as a fighter, just pure skill wise and influence on other people's fighting, although honestly he was a very poor trainer, I would have to go with Dirk. Dirk's idea of training was, beat you till you got it right, but nonetheless, his shield style was picked up by a lot of people, and most people were studying his fighting style.
And
So he was emulated even if he wasn't training people.
Yes,
he was emulated. People were just fighting just to try to keep up with them, and not get their teeth kicked in, metaphorically. He was maybe was a poor trainer, but a whole crop of really good fighters came up under his wing, and the Orkneys and later the Myrmidons. So you had, Wilhelm Skallagrim, Håkon. Håkon was a great fighter.
Yeah.
One of the best Caid fighters I've seen who has never won Crown. He was always the guy who I pull aside to warm me up at Crown because I knew he wasn't fighting, and I probably wouldn't be fighting a better fighter in the list. So.
Ooh.
Awesome. Well, let's cram another 13 or 14 years in 6 minutes. This has just been such a good conversation. It was really hard to manage the pace of it because I've really enjoyed all of your guys' thoughts and analysis on these decades. So I regret my apologies to the consorts. I'm going to just mention the crown winners for the next group, just so that we can get through things. Though I will absolutely adamantly say that there's no such thing as a reign without the consort. They just don't happen. You know, you have to have them. They're important. They're not just the person wins the list for.
I couldn't have done it without mine.
It's so funny. I heard someone say, well, they get to be a countess and a duchess. Why do they get to be a rose? It's like, we should make up more things for them to get to be.
Oh,
You
Lord,
just
yeah.
don't have any understanding. It doesn't happen without them.
Yep.
All right. So 2010, Wilhelm the First, followed by Edward the Third, followed by Sven the Third, followed by Patrick the Second, followed by Mansur the First. Congrats. Sven the Fourth, Conrad the Second. We're at 2014. Agrippa the First, Mansur the Second, and Athanric. Why I always butcher his name. Maybe he should hit me harder, and then no, I don't want that. Conrad the Third, Oz, and Marissa. She gets a shout out because I like eating the lumpia. And then Agrippa the Second. We're in the 2017. Alexander, Thonric again, and then maybe you guys can explain. It just says Regent Fisa. But let me finish the list real quick. Wilhelm, Agrippa, Adam, Wilhelm, Alexander, Panza, Valric, Adam, and Optimus. So that gets us current, I think.
Yeah. That's
So I really hate to have to cram so much into this, but this is actually kind of current history. So, you know, I'm not going to feel too bad. We're more looking into the history. But Haldar, why don't you just jump off? This is a big period. Talk about anything you want, whether it's fighters or training or styles or the kingdom in general.
Let's see, the last 6 or 7 years. Let's see, our calibration, first it normalized and then it split. We're still a very turny kingdom. We're still a very center punch kingdom. Lefties are still doing a lot of winning, but you're seeing the rise of the horsemen, and you're seeing a lot of smaller war bands crop up. So I think you're seeing both of the strands of Caidan tradition kind of come back into one thing, and it's been really beautiful to see.
Mansur, what are your thoughts on this period?
So, just like in the first 5 years or so, you hear three kings from Starkhofen. And so, and Patrick mentioned Conrad, but so there's this trend in Caid I've noticed since, I started playing, where the outer lying regions around downtown Caid are where all the best fighters are. I'm not saying that that's only where the best fighters are, but that's where you have the strongest pockets of talent pools, really high talent pools. Calafia, Western Seas, really good, hard-hitting fighters there. Nordvaca, which is Fresno. You see some in Winter Mist, the Horsemen, right? And then there's Starkhofen. So Starkhofen becomes a real force of nature in this time period.
And that's Vegas, right?
Yes, Vegas.
Okay.
And it all starts with Conrad. Aside from just being a hell of a fighter to fight, Conrad molded. So a Thanaric was sparred to Conrad, and Conrad molded a Thanaric from 180-pound Goth to a 260-pound monster of a man. And in my opinion, he's the best fighter in Caid right now, and it's not even close. He also trained Oz. Oz was squire to Conrad, and it just kind of just filters out from there, right? You got Thanric, Oz. They got a lot of really good fighters, a lot of really good knights in that household. You've got Sigvald, you've got Scaff, Longhair. Ulf was squire to a Thanric. Viscount Ulf is now up in Antir, and who's one of the best fighters down in where he lives in Vancouver, Washington. And they're really really good on the tourney field, and they're monsters on the war field. So to me, this is kind of like the decade of Starkoffen, where they really start to become a fighting force outside of Wintermist, because those horsemen, man, they know how to recruit and they train. They train hard. They've got a lot of really good fighters too. So.
Okay. Well, then let's get Patrick's observations.
I think in this decade, you definitely see the results of Conrad's training in Starkoffen becoming a powerhouse of tourney fighters, and a number of other places. The Wintermist produced a bunch of solid tournament fighters who've gone on to win crowns. The Calafia practice is still a ridiculously good practice. For me, one of the bigger factors that happened in this time period, this was right following my first crown win. And my first crown win, my thought after winning crown was, I better get to practice because I won crown. I'm supposed to be good at this. And now I'm on center stage. And this is when I first, and we had been in around the same circles for decades, and how we didn't really know each other, I don't know, given our histories. But this is when I first became associated with Duke Sean. And while I was crowned, I was told, oh, you have to go fight this guy, Duke Sean. I'm like, oh, okay, whatever. And I can tell long stories about that. But becoming associated with Sean and that training school drug me into a lot of a bigger school of fighting in the SCA than I had experienced before, and a number of other people as well. And this was when we started dragging people out to, hey, let's all go meet in Las Vegas and have a fighter weekend. We started having fighter weekends in Vegas, and Sean and some of the Artemisian guys would come down. This is where, for me, I saw a lot more integration of the Caidan hot stick tourney fighters with people from outside of the kingdom. And so we started having these get-togethers in Las Vegas, and people were coming down from Antir, and people were coming from Artemisia, people were coming from the West, and some from Adenbelt. And for me, this was my biggest period of growth. Really happened after I won crown, where I got to know all these people. Started going up to Sport of Kings. Very sad to see that event not currently happening. My favorite SCA event ever, especially in this period in time when I'm really have limited interest in war fighting and really focused on tournament fighting. And more Caidans started venturing out of the kingdom and going to these things and getting training from outside the kingdom. And I think in this time period, a really good start that we'd had in the 10 years before that just continued to grow because of those out of kingdom influences and people traveling more and getting to experience a wider range of fighting.
All right. Given the time, we're going to do the very abbreviated version of that conversation and jump right into my favorite part of who won. This is going to range for this conversation from Wilhelm I down to Optimus today. So we have a long period, and ask who won that period. Haldor.
I think Monsieur is right. I think Conrad won this period.
Monsieur, are you going to object to that assessment?
No, I would say Starkoffen and Wintermist, specifically Wiedwolf, and the Horseman.
Right. Patrick, your thoughts?
Definitely Conrad, not just for his obvious prowess in fighting and crowns and tournaments, but the lineage that grew from his training. He was definitely, in my mind, the biggest influence on our tournament fighting in this decade. Even though he's no longer in Kingdom, he's in Glenavon now.
Yep.
Awesome.
Really cool. So, man, we are really grateful that you three fine gentlemen could join us this evening and talk about Caid and let us geek out and ask all our weird questions that we like to do. It's been really educational, and the time has just flown. I'm still kind of shocked that we ran out of time the way we did, and I think that's really just based on the value of the conversation, the analysis that you guys were able to give us. So thank you each very much, Duke Patrick, Sir Haldar, and Duke Mansur. We're really grateful that you could join us. And since we are on the other side of 7:30, getting closer to 7:40, I'm just going to go ahead and say good night. There will be something in the SCA Coaches Corner next week for His Grace Brennan and myself. We're very grateful to our producer, Sir Taildward, and we are out. Thank you very much, and have a lovely evening and a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.